A single mother helps a millionaire fix his broken car on the side of the road, and when he sees the ring on her finger, he is immediately stunned. No one had ever seen her before. No one remembered her name. But on that scorching afternoon, when the sun seemed to melt the asphalt, she became the lifeline for a man who appeared to have it all. In the harsh summer heat of Texas, the asphalt stretched out in a fiery blaze beneath the sun, as though it were being burned away. The wind was nearly still, and there wasn't a tree in sight along the desolate road. The silver Maserati Quattroporte, a symbol of luxury, suddenly stalled in the middle of Highway 271, and white smoke began to rise from the hood, a clear sign of engine failure. Inside the car, Brandon Whitaker, CEO of the multinational conglomerate Whitaker Global, slammed his hand down on the steering wheel with the force of someone used to controlling everything, except moments like this. His face turned red with anger, but deeper than that, a panic seeped into every fiber of his being. He glanced at his platinum Swiss watch, worth $80,000, 11:43 a.m. Only 17 minutes left until the start of the billion-dollar strategy meeting with investors, a meeting that could decide the fate of the conglomerate he inherited from his unyielding father. He tore off his tie, undid the top button of his shirt, and stepped out of the car. The heat immediately slapped him in the face like a fist. Sweat poured down his back, soaking through his fine Italian silk shirt. He opened the hood, and a thick puff of smoke burst out, causing him to instinctively take a step back. For a moment, the man who had once controlled millions of dollars stood frozen, helpless, like a child lost for the first time. At that moment, an old engine rumbled in the distance. A battered, rusted Ford F-150 pickup truck slowly came to a stop by the roadside. The engine sputtered to a halt. The door opened. Out stepped a black woman with a firm stride and a look of no fear in her eyes. Her hair was tied back in a neat bun, her checkered shirt rolled up at the sleeves, her jeans stained with motor oil. Nothing like the polished image of a tech mogul lost in his high-tech failures. She planted her feet firmly on the ground, the sunlight reflecting off her brown skin, making her glow against the fiery backdrop of the sky. Her work gloves still on, a wrench resting on the passenger seat. She approached Brandon, sizing him up as if inspecting an old machine, then asked flatly, "Car's broken?" Brandon furrowed his brows, instinctively taking a half-step back. He wasn't used to being questioned first, especially not in a situation where he felt vulnerable. This woman was Rachel Monroe, a well-known mechanic in the area, and a single mother on her way to the shop after picking up parts for a customer's truck. But Brandon didn't know that. To him, she was just a stranger, appearing at the wrong time, or rather, at the perfect time to challenge his proud ego. What Brandon didn't know was that this seemingly ordinary woman in front of him, with her cold, steel-like gaze, would be the one to unmask the Whitaker family's decades-long facade, starting with the sapphire ring on her finger. Brandon narrowed his eyes, a look of skepticism and irritation creeping into his gaze, as he noticed that the woman in front of him wasn't the least bit intimidated by his powerful appearance and designer clothes. He was used to polite nods, respectful "yes, sirs," and flattering smiles from employees, partners, and even the media. But this woman, Rachel Monroe, stood tall, eyes unflinching, voice firm, with no hint of submission. Brandon furrowed his brow, his lower lip slightly curling in the instinctive arrogance of someone born into privilege. "You're sure you know how to fix cars?" The question was not only filled with doubt, but also carried a quiet prejudice. A woman, a black woman, dressed like she worked with her hands. What could she possibly know about touching his million-dollar car? Rachel didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't show any emotion. She simply responded flatly, "I'm a mechanic. I have a shop 10 miles away." Her voice was mechanical, but her gaze was sharp. Without asking for permission, she moved forward, opened the hood again, leaned in to inspect, and in less than 30 seconds gave her conclusion. Cooling system's busted. You've got about 5 minutes before you restart it and the engine's gone. You're lucky. Brandon stood still, unable to say a word. Part of him was shocked by being stopped dead in his tracks. Another part of him was trying to analyze the situation, a businessman's habit. But what confused him the most wasn't the engine, but how she didn't see him as anything special. She didn't ask for the price, didn't butter him up. Rachel simply did her job. She walked back to her truck, retrieved an old oil-stained toolbox, and returned to the Maserati. Her hands, rough and blackened with grease, moved with the precision of a skilled artisan. She unscrewed, checked, reattached a hose, temporarily cooling the system by rerouting the coolant. Brandon couldn't help but stare. Not because he was attracted, but because of the sense of losing control. From the time he was a child, he had been taught that the world operated on hierarchy. The strong command, the weak obey. His father, Carter Whitaker, was the embodiment of that philosophy. A man who built the family's conglomerate into an empire with ruthless decisions and deals that the law hadn't caught up with. Brandon had been raised in that principle. He went to Yale, was sent to Harvard Business School not out of passion, but because Carter wanted an heir who wouldn't make mistakes. Every step of Brandon's life was a move on his father's chessboard, from his field of study, to his best friend, to his fiancée, Elise Harrington, the daughter of a fashion mogul, who Carter saw as the final move to corner the luxury consumer market. In that world, someone like Rachel, without family ties, no Ivy League degree, no connections to the powerful, was beneath his notice. Yet, here she was, saving his reputation just before $1 million meeting. Rachel tightened a clamp, wiped her hands on a rag, and then quietly said, "It's done, but it's temporary. You've got about 2 hours before the car heats up again." Brandon swallowed hard, unsure whether to thank her or hide his discomfort. He wasn't used to feeling dependent, but he also wasn't used to the gaze of someone else that he couldn't read. She didn't seem to be trying to impress him, and that made him even more uneasy. He pulled out his wallet, took out a few $100 bills and handed them over. But as she reached out to accept them, Brandon's gaze immediately froze. The bright sunlight reflected off something small on her finger, an old silver ring with a blue sapphire stone, the same piece of jewelry that had once belonged to his mother, the one that 10-year-old Brandon had secretly slipped into his pocket and quietly handed to a girl in an orphanage as a meaningless promise, "I'll come back." That ring, there was no mistaking it, and Rachel, this cold, indifferent mechanic in front of him, was no stranger. The moment Rachel reached out to take the money, Brandon's gaze suddenly froze. The $100 bills in his hand seemed to vanish from his awareness, as the refracted light from a small object on her finger awakened a storm of forgotten memories that had slumbered for 20 years. The ring, a thin silver band with a classic design, set with a deep blue sapphire, unmistakable. Brandon's eyes widened, his heartbeat misaligning with his breath. That was the ring his mother had left behind before she passed away from cancer when he was just 9 years old. The very same ring that he had given to a little girl in the orphanage, under the old oak tree, as a promise that he would come back, that he wouldn't forget her. A small gift, but sacred in the heart of a lonely child, amidst the cold world of the elite. And now it was on the hand of the woman he had both doubted and despised, Rachel Monroe. Brandon stood frozen, unable to utter a word. His eyes quickly scanned from the ring to Rachel's face, desperately searching for traces of the little girl from so long ago. There was something familiar. That gaze, those cheekbones, that straight-backed posture. But time had shaped that childhood face into a mature, experienced woman, with the hardened look of someone who no longer waited for anyone to return. That ring, Brandon stammered, his throat dry. Where did you get it? Rachel hesitated for a moment, instinctively closing her hand around the ring as though something in his gaze had exposed her. It was left by my mother, she replied briefly, her eyes never leaving Brandon's. But beneath that gaze lay a layer of unreadable defense. Why? Is there a problem? Brandon opened his mouth about to say something, then froze. How could he say that he was the boy from all those years ago, the one who had placed that ring on her hand? How could he admit that he had forgotten her, had left behind his promise in the orphanage to step into a world of shareholder meetings, dinners with caviar and Dom Perignon, arranged relationships, and paths paved with power? He had never returned. Never. Behind the polished exterior, beneath the perfectly tailored suit, was a Brandon Whitaker who had always been controlled by his father like a pawn. Carter Whitaker had never let emotions interfere with his strategic decisions. The day Brandon secretly visited the orphanage to play with a little girl, his father cut off funding to the place, forcing it to close for unclear financial reasons. No warning, no clear explanation. Everything disappeared as if it had never existed, including the girl with the sapphire ring on her finger. Back then, Brandon had been just a child. He didn't understand why he couldn't go back, and over time, he forgot. Under his father's iron guidance, he buried that memory deep within his mind, in exchange for recognition, to become the man Carter wanted. Now, that memory surfaced like a knife, not only cutting into his conscience but also igniting a fear. She might know more than just the ring. Brandon took a step back, took a deep breath, and tried to steady his voice. Sorry, it looks very familiar. Rachel pressed her lips together, saying nothing. She stepped back, shoved the money into her jeans pocket, then turned to walk toward her pickup truck. If your car breaks down again, turn left into Aurora City, she said without turning her head. My shop's behind the old wooden sign. Brandon stood still, his eyes never leaving Rachel's back. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but deep down he knew this was not just a random car repair. He had just touched a past he thought was gone, and it had left a mark, with a ring. The silver Maserati drove off, leaving a thin trail of dust on the desolate road, the engine's roar fading in the oppressive Texas midday heat. Rachel stood still beside her old pickup truck, her hand still loosely holding the greasy rag she had just used to wipe her hands. A soft breeze passed, but it was not enough to cool the scorching heat that seemed to melt everything, including the memories that had been dormant within her for 2 decades. She raised her hand and gently touched the old silver ring, the only piece of jewelry she had worn her whole life. The small sapphire gleamed in the sunlight, but in Rachel's eyes it was no longer just a piece of jewelry. It was a promise that had been broken. He doesn't remember anything anymore, she whispered, her gaze following the fading dust cloud, just like when he left. 10 minutes later, Rachel climbed into her truck, not in a hurry. She knew she had missed her deadline to deliver parts to a client, but she no longer cared. The unexpected return of Brandon Whitaker was not a passing breeze. It was a hidden storm, awakening the scar she had tried to bury under the toughened skin of a single mother, a mechanic who seemed only concerned with spark plugs, oil, and earning enough money to send her daughter to school. Her daughter, Naomi, 13 years old. A gentle, smart angel who had never known her father and never asked about him. Rachel had never told her about the orphanage, about the boy who had once given her this ring, who had whispered, "I'll come back, I promise." Brandon never came back. She didn't wait, but she had never taken off the ring. Not because she still loved him, but because she had never forgiven him. Back at the small repair shop on the edge of Aurora City, a dying town in the heart of Texas, where people left more than they arrived, Rachel turned off the engine and slowly pulled up the heavy metal door. Inside, the smell of motor oil and hot metal filled the air, as if it were a part of her body. In the small room at the back of the shop, once a storage area, now a makeshift living room and bedroom, a faded photograph hung on the gray wall, a picture of Rachel at 12, standing in front of the New Hope orphanage beside a skinny white boy who was grinning widely. Brandon. That boy once said, "What's broken can be fixed." She believed him. She waited. But one day, the orphanage managers announced that Brandon had left for good. She asked why. No one answered. Only a few weeks later, the orphanage's funding was cut, and it was closed for lack of operational conditions. The children were scattered, sent elsewhere. Rachel was placed in a foster home, then ran away at 14 after being exploited as a maid without pay by that same family. There was only one person who didn't abandon her at that time: Uncle Luther, her mother's brother, the quiet man who had been a mechanic in the army and now lived in seclusion in the small town, running a car shop to make ends meet. He took Rachel in, taught her how to live, how to hold a wrench, how to distinguish the sound of a choked engine, and how to tighten bolts not by force, but by feel. Rachel learned quickly, and she lived quietly, until she was 24, when Naomi was born, the result of a mistake on a rainy night, with a man who disappeared immediately after. Rachel decided she would never depend on anyone again. She rebuilt the shop, gave it a new name, Monroe Auto Works. The hand-painted sign, simple, without any flourish. But anyone who passed through the town knew, car trouble? Knock on Monroe's door. And today, the past she thought had been burned away with the sign saying, "New Hope Orphanage Closed," suddenly returned. In the form of a man in a silk tie, wearing Tom Ford cologne, driving a Maserati, the one who had once held her hand under the oak tree, saying, "I'll come back." Brandon Whitaker. A name she still saw in the papers, in economic news, in photographs of handshakes with the president or walking the red carpet with his wealthy fiancée at a consumer industry event. But above all, that name was the name of the person who had indirectly destroyed her life. Because it was his father, Carter Whitaker, who had ordered the funding to stop for the orphanage that year. Rachel had heard the rumors. Carter found out his son had relations with an orphaned child from a lower class, and he saw that as a threat, an emotional weakness that needed to be eradicated. Rachel wasn't sure how much of that was true, and how much was embellished. But she had never believed Brandon was blameless. He had promised, and he hadn't kept his word. That evening, when Naomi went to bed, Rachel sat alone in the living room, the small desk lamp casting light on her old work table. She opened the drawer, pulled out a wooden box. Inside were a stack of documents, old newspapers, and a file with a faded seal. Whitaker Development Project, Confidential. She had collected them herself, over 8 years, quietly, like a grave digger. The map of the land where her mother had once lived, now the site of the Aurora Rising Real Estate Development Project by the Whitaker Group. The attached document read, "Urgent retrieval due to waterway zoning. Property transferred to Whitaker Holdings through legal representative Carter Whitaker. Confirming no legal heirs." A lie. Her mother, Amelia Monroe, had never died. Rachel had proof, a handwritten letter from 8 years ago with no return address, but the handwriting she recognized immediately, her mother's. In the letter, she wrote only one line: "I didn't abandon you. They forced me to disappear." Rachel gently brushed her fingers over the fading ink. She had never told anyone, not Luther, not Naomi, but now enough was enough. Brandon was back. Not as the old friend, but as the heir of the one who had taken everything from her. And if he thought she was still the little girl waiting under the oak tree for a promise, then he was about to face a very different woman, one who no longer expected to be remembered by her name, but who would make them remember the price of betrayal. The first breeze of the afternoon swept through the rusted tin roof of the Monroe Auto Works shop, carrying with it the clinking sound of tools hanging on the walls, clashing together like the drumbeats signaling a storm was about to arrive. Inside the shop, the pungent smell of motor oil and burnt metal filled the air, blending with the rhythmic sound of metal tapping continuously from the lift at the far left corner. Rachel Monroe, her disheveled hair still not tied back, knelt beside an old pickup truck engine, unscrewing bolts as though she were tearing apart a memory that could not be denied. She wasn't doing it to repair. The engine should have been finished yesterday, but she had torn it apart for the third time. Not because of a technical fault, but because of the rage simmering in her chest, a pent-up anger that had been suppressed for years, now suddenly erupting, all because of one glance, at a past embodied by Brandon Whitaker. A sharp screech echoed as the wrench slipped from the bolt, causing her glove to come off and cut a small line on Rachel's palm. Blood began to trickle out, but she didn't stop. "Enough," a deep voice echoed from the workshop door. Luther Monroe, her uncle, who had raised her after her parents died, stepped in with a somber look in his eyes. He was a big man, his weathered face marked by the sun, his temples graying, and his hands calloused from years of holding a hammer. In his hand was a glass of cold lemonade, still dripping with condensation. Rachel didn't turn around. Her hands continued to remove the cylinder head as if every bolt was a chain that needed to be broken. "You're destroying the carburetor," he said. His voice wasn't accusatory, just thick with a deep concern Rachel couldn't pretend not to hear. She paused, her shoulders shaking. Then, unable to hold back, she broke down. Silent tears flowing down her cheeks, dripping onto the hot metal. "It's Brandon," she choked out. "Brandon Whitaker, he doesn't recognize me, just looked at the ring." Luther froze. A brief silence filled the workshop. He stepped forward, placed the glass of lemonade on the steel table, and then sat next to Rachel. Not rushing, not intruding. Only when she lifted her face, her eyes swollen and her voice cracked, did he speak. He stood there, looking at me like I was a stranger, like there was never a promise, like there was never a tree, an orphanage. An afternoon I waited. Luther looked at her, his eyes filled with deep sorrow, then whispered, "The boy who promised to come back, but never did?" Rachel nodded. Her lips pressed tight, her hands clenched so hard they turned white. "And now, who is he?" Luther asked. "The CEO of Whitaker Global," Rachel replied. "The son of Carter Whitaker, the one who will build that shopping center, right on the land where my mother and I lived." Her final words rang like a hammer striking a hot piece of iron. Luther stood up suddenly, pacing around the workshop, then turned back with a look of cold fury Rachel had never seen in him before. "Carter Whitaker," he hissed, as if the name had a metallic taste. "He's the one who signed the papers to seize the land when you weren't old enough to sign your own name. He's the one who forced your sister, Amelia, to leave town in the night, leaving no trace. You think this is all a coincidence?" Rachel looked up, silent. Luther had never spoken of that fateful night, when her mother, Amelia Monroe, disappeared just days after the government suddenly ordered the confiscation of land located on the region's largest waterway. "He didn't just take the land," Luther continued, his voice deepening like the rumble of an engine. "He took their honor, their blood, their family." Rachel bit her lip. "And now," she whispered, "his son stands before me, with the face of a complete stranger. He even said my ring looked familiar." Luther narrowed his eyes and slowly sat down on the familiar wooden chair. His hand instinctively reached up to stroke his beard, a habit when he was deep in thought. He spoke. "I once thought maybe the boy was just a victim. But if now he doesn't recognize you, if he shows up just as the project begins, if he only looks at the ring and doesn't remember your name, then I'm not sure he's blameless anymore." Rachel nodded. Everything inside her had gone beyond personal hurt. This was no longer about a forgotten heart, but about justice being denied. "I have the files," Rachel exhaled, slowly standing up. "I have the old map, the fake death certificate for my mother. I even have the handwritten letter she sent 8 years ago. I just never dared to say it, because there was no one to trust." Luther looked at Rachel for a long time, then gave a slow nod. "You're right, it's time to stop fixing cars, and start fixing the wrongs." She stood still. For the first time in years, Rachel no longer saw herself just as a single mother, a mechanic. She saw herself as someone holding a crucial piece to expose an entire empire of lies. Brandon Whitaker might have forgotten, but he was about to remember. Because Rachel Monroe was ready to burn that Maserati, if necessary, to reclaim the name he had once taken lightly. As night fell over the town of Aurora, the Monroe Auto Works shop sank into silence, with only the faint light shining through the crack in the window of the small bedroom at the back. Inside, Rachel sat on the old wooden floor, her back against the wall, her breath slow as though she were holding back a storm raging inside her chest. The conversation with Uncle Luther still echoed in her mind, each word like nails hammered deep into her heart. "If he doesn't recognize you, then I'm not sure he's innocent anymore." She reached under the bed, pulling out a small brown wooden box, darkened by time. This old box wasn't just a place to hold memories. It was a place to hold the truth, a truth that had been buried deep for nearly 20 years, out of fear, uncertainty, and because she hadn't been strong enough to fight alone. Rachel opened the lid. Inside, everything was neatly arranged in the way someone who was all too familiar with keeping secrets would do it. The first layer was filled with old newspaper clippings, cut from business magazines, the financial section of the New York Observer, and a few printed photos from social media. The articles bore headlines such as "Brandon Whitaker, the ideal heir to the Whitaker global empire." From Harvard to the heights of corporate power, the journey of a young and promising CEO. Engaged to Elise Harrington, the billion-dollar union of 2 dynasties. The articles were marked with red pen, underlining sections about land deals, upscale residential projects, particularly the Aurora Rising project. On an accompanying map, the land shaded in red was the very place Rachel's family had once lived, where she and her mother had planted flowers, lemon trees, and even the oak tree where Brandon had tied a blue ribbon, promising to return. It was their land, but the name on the papers now read Carter Whitaker. Rachel sighed and carefully flipped the layer of newspapers, revealing the secret compartment beneath. What lay there made her heart ache with every touch. A thick legal file over 300 pages long, stamped with a faint but clear phrase, "Mandatory buyout, Aurora Economic Zone Development Project." Legal representative, Carter Whitaker, CEO of Whitaker Global. One page was a death certificate confirming that Amelia Monroe, Rachel's mother, had died in a car accident in 2007. But Rachel knew as instinctively as any child would that her mother had never died. That document was a lie, and she had proof. A handwritten letter in her mother's distinctive cursive sent from an undisclosed location in 2016. The letter contained only one line. "My daughter, I didn't abandon you, they forced me to disappear." Below was a shaky signature. Amelia. That letter had driven Rachel mad. She spent weeks comparing the handwriting, asking Luther, checking it against old postcards her mother had sent. It was her. No mistake. But who were they? And why did they want her mother to disappear? The answer lay in the transfer contract she found through an old friend working in the Jefferson County Land Registry office. A blurry copy, but still legible. This property is fully transferred to Whitaker Holdings under Clause 12B, Community Benefit and Regional Economic Development Agreement. There are no legal heirs recorded at the time of signing. Recipient, Carter Whitaker. Rachel remembered the look in her former colleague's eyes as they handed her the file, a mixture of sympathy and fear. "I shouldn't have shown you this, but if it's you, I guess you have a right to know." In Rachel's mind, all the pieces started falling into place. Carter Whitaker was not just a cold CEO. He was the one who orchestrated a campaign to erase an entire family, to legitimize a strategic piece of land, located on one of the largest underground water sources in the South. Aurora wasn't just where she was born. It was the lifeblood of tens of thousands of people, and Carter saw its value long before anyone else. He didn't shy away from any method. He didn't hesitate. And now he was using his son, Brandon, as the new face, youthful and clean, for an empire built on forged documents and real pain. Rachel clenched a page of the documents, her palm sweating. She looked at the signature line. Carter Whitaker's bold, decisive handwriting felt like a dagger to her heart. She had once thought Brandon was innocent, that he was just a boy swallowed up by a world his father had set up for him. But today, when she saw his eyes that didn't recognize her, didn't remember the promise, she knew. Even if it was by accident, Brandon was still part of the system that had crushed her. A slight noise came from the hallway. Naomi, her daughter, cracked the door open. "Mom, you're not asleep?" Rachel jumped, quickly closing the wooden box and hiding it under the bed. She turned, smiling gently, her face quickly regaining composure. "Not yet, sweetie. I'm just reading some documents." Naomi nodded, her eyes still heavy with sleep. "Tomorrow I have a presentation on truth and justice. The teacher said each of us should tell a real story. Can I tell mine?" Rachel froze. After a long pause, she softly replied, "As long as you know what the truth is, you have every right to tell it." When Naomi returned to her bed, Rachel remained still by the edge of the bed, her eyes fixed on the window. Outside, the streetlights cast light onto the old oak tree growing beside the shop, the only tree left after the land seizure all those years ago. She whispered softly, "They buried my mother. They took our land, but they haven't buried me." She clenched her fist. If Brandon was the heir, then he would have to face the truth. A truth that couldn't be bought with a check, erased from the papers, or ignored like just another face in the crowd. The morning sunlight gently poured over the town of Aurora, a surprising contrast to the stifling heat of the previous day. Inside the Monroe Auto Works shop, there was no sound of metal tapping, nor the scent of burning engine parts. Only silence, as if the entire space was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Rachel had woken early, making coffee like every other day, but the cup had long gone cold on the table, untouched. Her mind kept circling back to the wooden box under the bed, to the words, the signatures, and her mother's slanted handwriting, proof that the truth had been twisted, hidden, reshaped to serve the power of others. Then the familiar sound of an engine rumbled outside, not the roar of a Maserati, not the hum of a supercar, but the sound of an old sedan, quietly pulling up in front of the shop. A figure appeared in the slanted sunlight, wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, his face tired but determined. Brandon Whitaker. He stepped inside, and the air between them was taut, like a guitar string pulled too tight. Rachel stood silently behind the desk, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, her gaze wary, no longer that of someone who had been hurt, but of a woman ready to face what was coming. Brandon hesitated for a moment, then pulled a small object wrapped in cloth from his jacket pocket. "I brought this to return," he said, unwrapping the cloth to reveal a wooden brooch shaped like a bird, its simple carving full of emotion, its tail slightly chipped, and the wings etched with the initials R&B in worn knife strokes. Rachel held her breath. Her eyes blinked slowly. "You were the one who taught me how to carve wood," Brandon said slowly. "When I was teased by all the other boys at the orphanage for not knowing how to use a knife, for not being able to carve anything other than poking myself, you gave me the first carving knife. You told me I didn't need to be strong to cut deep, just patient." He bent down, his eyes meeting hers. "You taught me that, but I forgot until yesterday." Rachel took the brooch, her hands trembling slightly. The memory, which had seemed to rot away, surged back with such intensity it left her body numb. She remembered the nights when the two of them sat behind the orphanage, carving wood with knives as if it was the only way to drown out the cries of the new arrivals. She remembered Brandon's rare smile when he said, "I'll come back. I promise." She choked on her words. "You promised to come back," she whispered, as though saying it louder would make the pain burst out. "But then you disappeared. No words, no letter. No sign." Brandon was silent for a long time, then answered in a hoarse voice, "I tried, I swear to you, I tried, but my father, he cut everything off." He sat down in the chair across from her, his head lowered. "I didn't know until I was 17, when I accidentally read in the company's charity records that New Hope Orphanage had its funding pulled just weeks after I was banned from visiting. I didn't know my father was behind it. I thought the orphanage closed because it ran out of money, because no one cared." Rachel looked at him, her gaze no longer full of hatred like yesterday, but still full of caution. She breathed slowly, then spoke. "Did you know the orphanage was shut down, the children scattered, and I was sent to a foster family, where I had to wash dishes, scrub floors, and do laundry for them like a free maid? I ran away when I was 14, living in Luther's shed for nearly half a year before I had the courage to step outside." Brandon looked up, horrified. "Rachel, I had no idea." "Yes, you didn't know. Because your life has been a series of not knowing, carefully arranged for you. You went to Harvard, you had rich parents, you had a fiancée, Elise Harrington, chosen not for love but for wealth. You didn't need to know about what was twisted, cut, or destroyed to build the comfortable world around you." Brandon was silent. Rachel moved closer, pulling a thin file from the desk drawer and placing it in front of him. Her eyes were no longer those of the girl from the past. They were the eyes of someone holding the judgment for an entire empire of deceit. Do you know about the Aurora Rising project, the one your father's about to break ground on? Do you know what land it's being built on? Brandon looked at the file, flipping through the pages. An old map, the transfer document, Carter Whitaker's signature, a fake death certificate for Amelia Monroe. His throat tightened. It all felt like a knife through the fragile trust that remained. This can't. It can, and it has happened, Rachel interrupted. My mother, Amelia, didn't die in an accident. She disappeared, and I have reason to believe she was forced to disappear so the land could be legalized under the name of no legal heirs. Brandon gasped, his eyes still glued to his father's handwriting. The contract felt like a death sentence written in advance. Rachel, I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, she replied, her voice like a slash. Just listen and decide. Because you, whether a victim or the heir to cruelty, are the last one who can choose to stand on the side of the truth. The room fell silent. Brandon folded the file, placing his hand on his chest, where the wooden brooch was tucked into his jacket pocket. For the first time, he truly felt, that he didn't know who he was anymore. Carter's son, or the child who had been taken away from an unfinished memory. He looked at Rachel. She was no longer a fragment of a memory. She was real, a living witness to everything the Whitaker empire had trampled to rise. The air inside Monroe Auto Works grew thick. Outside, the sun began to rise higher, but inside the small room at the back, the light was just enough to reveal Brandon's eyes where Rachel saw, for the first time, not pride, but the real confusion of a man standing between two worlds, one of truth and one of family. Brandon placed his hand on the file Rachel had just handed him, but he didn't flip it over. It seemed the weight of that thin paper was heavier than the billion-dollar legacy he was about to inherit. I'm getting married to Elise Harrington, Brandon said slowly, his eyes avoiding Rachel's, as though he couldn't bear to look directly. In 3 weeks. His words made the air in the room feel like it had paused for a moment. It's a strategic marriage, he continued. No love. There never was. Rachel showed no surprise. Although her heart tightened, her face remained unchanged. That fragile emotion, she had learned to lock it behind an iron shell, after the world had laughed at a little orphan girl talking about love. Brandon continued, almost like confessing. My father, he sees marrying Elise as a move. The Harrington family owns the largest fashion retail chain on the East Coast. A merger between our two corporations will take Whitaker Global from real estate and energy into global consumer goods. Elise knows that. I know that. But we all pretend. He chuckled softly, but there was no joy in it. I once believed I was born to inherit it all. Everyone said so, but I never felt it was mine. I hate the position of CEO. I hate the congratulations, the articles, the parties where everyone smiles, but no one really looks at me. Brandon lifted his head, his eyes meeting Rachel's, no longer avoiding her gaze. Until I saw the ring on your hand. All the memories came flooding back like a storm, not clear, not coherent, but enough for me to know I had to find you, even if just to understand why. I lost that. Rachel stood still. She said nothing. Brandon's story sounded like a confession, an attempt to touch something real in a life programmed by power and prestige. But for her, that wasn't enough. Because in her mind right now, it wasn't just the ring or the promise. It was the document signed by Carter Whitaker, his father, to seize her family's ancestral land. It was the fake death certificate bearing her mother's name. It was the edited maps, the planning drawings that turned the place where she was born into a parking lot and a shopping center. And Brandon didn't know that. Not because he was lying, but because he had never been allowed to know. The fire inside Rachel now was no longer an outburst of anger. It was a blade sharpened by pain and silence, waiting for the right moment to cut through the curtain that the Whittaker empire had draped over the past. She slowly walked toward the metal shelf where the toolboxes were, pulled out a thin file, different from the stack Brandon had read. She turned back and placed it on the table, her eyes never leaving him. "Do you think I kept all of this just to wait for you to recognize me?" Her voice was calm, but beneath it there was a whirlwind of deep, hidden hurt. Brandon frowned, his eyes scanning the new file. He opened it, and immediately his breath caught. The first page? A death certificate for Amelia Monroe, stamped by the Jefferson County Department of Justice. Under the signature, Carter Whittaker. The faded red seal, still enough to confirm its legality, on paper. The next page. A handwritten letter, soft, slanted handwriting, smeared with faint water stains. The letter Rachel had received 8 years ago. "My daughter, I did not abandon you. They forced me to disappear. I love you. Mom." Brandon looked up, his eyes wide, his face pale. "God," he muttered, "this signature." "Your father forged the papers to declare my mother dead," Rachel coldly continued. "She didn't die. She was forced to disappear, and the land, where my family lived, worked, and raised me, was transferred to Whittaker Holdings under the guise of unclaimed property. From a lie. A stamp. A signature." Brandon recoiled, as though punched in the chest. I didn't know. I swear, Rachel, I believe you didn't know," she interrupted, her voice softer this time. "But that's the issue, Brandon. You grew up in a mansion built on forged papers and the tears of people like my mother. And now you have to choose, either continue to live in it or tear it down." Brandon collapsed into the chair, his hands clutching his head. The truth that had just been revealed was like a deep cut into the foundation of his life. He hadn't just lost an old friend. He had just lost his belief in bloodline, family, and the business ethics of a father revered by all of America. "I need time," he gasped. "You don't have much time," Rachel replied. "In 3 weeks, you'll be standing before hundreds of cameras, announcing the groundbreaking of the Aurora Rising Complex, a project named after your family, built on the land stolen through blood from someone else." Brandon looked at Rachel, his eyes filled with conflict. But for the first time, in that gaze, was an awakening. A man, born in the shadow of a deceitful legacy, was stepping out into the light for the first time, blinding, painful, but irreversible. As Rachel left the shop to prepare to pick Naomi up from school, Brandon remained motionless in the back room, a room without air conditioning, where only the sound of an old fan creaking on the ceiling and the dim light of the Texas midday filtered through the blinds. The stacks of documents, signatures, the red seals on yellowed paper, each one struck down like a hammer against the shell he had lived inside for his entire life. Carter Whittaker, his father, the man America revered as a business mastermind, a real estate king after the Great Depression, now stood before him not as a leader, but as the architect of an empire built on the deliberate disappearance of people like Rachel, like Amelia Monroe. He knew he couldn't wait until the shareholder meeting. He couldn't wait until the fake engagement party with Elise Harrington. He had to know right now. He had to see it all with his own eyes. He had to know if his father was hiding anything else. That evening, Brandon returned to the Whittaker mansion. located on the hill north of Houston, a sprawling estate of nearly 10,000 square feet, white walls, classical marble columns, and an iron gate with the family crest. For the first time, he felt a sense of alienation in what he had always called home. Taking advantage of the night security shift change and the butler's weekend off, Brandon quietly entered the family library, the room where his father kept personal files, project journals, and sensitive documents that weren't digitized in the company's system. Carter had once said, "There are things that shouldn't exist on a server. Every hard drive can be hacked, but no one can open a drawer unless they know the key is in their blood." Brandon knew his father didn't speak figuratively. He entered the library, a spacious room with dark wooden shelves running up to the ceiling, soft yellow light reflecting off the gleaming wooden floors. Beneath the large Persian rug in the center of the room, he pulled out a hidden floor safe he had once spotted when he was a child. The key he had once secretly copied when his father fell asleep on the sofa. It was the day Brandon graduated from Harvard. His father had handed him a glass of scotch, saying nothing except, "From now on, you'll know that success isn't about fairness." The key turned with a soft click. The safe opened. Inside, there were dozens of leather-bound files, each labeled with a project code and classification stamp. He ran his hand over each one: Crimson, Equinox, Selene. Then stopped at a dark brown file. No label on the cover. Just one word handwritten. Aurora. Brandon opened the file. His composure slowly slipped away. The first page was a map of Monroe's residential area, once farmland, homes, and a lake, Rachel's mother's land, marked in red. Next to it was the Phase 1 development plan, signed by Carter Whitaker and a legal officer from Jefferson County. Next was the forced sale contract. Due to the absence of legal heirs, the property is under state control and transferred to Whitaker Holdings under Clause 46B, Strategic Development Objective for the Aurora region. But what nearly made Brandon drop the papers was the death certificate included in the file. Deceased, Amelia Monroe. Cause, traffic accident. No identifiable remains. Verified by Dr. Martin Fenner. Authorized legal signatory, Carter Whitaker. Brandon read it over and over. No way, no way. He remembered clearly. Carter had always said that land deals in Texas were clean, that he only took what the law allowed. But the fake death certificate, and worse, his father's signature on a false declaration, was undeniable proof. He flipped to the next page, where a handwritten note was stapled in. Ensure no third parties are involved when completing the transfer. Avoid any connections to Amelia. Any leaks, handle according to emergency protocol. His father's handwriting. Brandon sank to the floor, his body feeling drained of energy. He had just seen the true face of his father. Not just a cold businessman, but a manipulator of other people's fates through paperwork and power. He whispered, "My father faked her death just to take the land." Each word fell from his mouth like fragments of a crumbling world. For years, he had been taught that ethics were a luxury in business, that the strong survive and the weak are left behind. But he had never thought of himself as the heir to a legacy built on the blood and tears of the innocent. In his eyes, the meetings, the billion-dollar contracts, the luxurious parties, now seemed like a massive veil of deception. And he, Brandon Whitaker, was the one holding the key to tearing down that veil. Brandon placed the file back into the briefcase, locked the safe again. He knew he couldn't let it fall into his father's hands. He couldn't let a single detail be destroyed before Rachel could bring the truth into the light. He left the library, turning off the lights. The moonlight streamed through the window, casting his shadow long across the marble floor. And in the mansion he had once called home, Brandon felt more alone and awakened than ever before, but it was also the first time he truly felt alive. Night fell over Aurora like a thick velvet curtain, enveloping the small town in a dense silence. But inside the old Monroe Auto Works garage, the air was boiling like a storm held in check, waiting to explode. Rachel sat amid the piles of paperwork spread across the metal table, the flickering fluorescent light above her barely holding on. In front of her lay all the evidence she and Brandon had gathered over the past 2 days. The fake death certificate of her mother, the land confiscation contracts, the original planning maps with handwritten alterations, and a series of internal emails from Whitaker Global's legal team that Brandon had just extracted from the company's servers. Emails discussing the risk of a leak of the original information regarding the Monroe land, with clear tension in each line. Next to Rachel, Uncle Luther sat silently like an old stone. He had read it all. Every page, every line, felt like peeling back a part of a history he had witnessed with blood and tears. When Rachel pushed the last file toward him, he looked up. "You've made up your mind?" His voice was soft but heavy, like a solemn vow. Rachel nodded. "I'm going to confront him, tonight, at the groundbreaking ceremony." Luther clenched his fist, his eyes darkening. He slowly stood and walked toward the wooden shelf at the far end of the garage, where he kept a tin box full of memories he never wanted to reopen. He pulled out an old photograph and handed it to Rachel. The photo showed a brown-skinned woman, tall and slender, standing before a plot of land shaded by trees with a basket of fresh vegetables in her hands. Her hair was loose, her smile gentle, but her eyes held something very familiar to Rachel: determination. At the bottom right of the photo, the faded caption read, "Amelia, March 2003. Rachel stared at the photo for a long time, then whispered, "She never disappeared. They made her disappear." Luther sat back down, his voice growing heavy. "Carter Whitaker destroyed our family once before. Don't you see? He still holds both the law and the media in his hands. They can do it again, and this time it will be even more sophisticated. I have nothing left to lose." Rachel answered, her eyes fixed on the ring on her finger. The silver ring with the sapphire stone, the only thing that kept the promise of the past from being buried. She spun it slowly and whispered as if to herself, "My mother gave me this ring. Brandon gave it to me as a promise, and now it will be my declaration of war." Silence enveloped them again. After a moment, Luther sighed deeply. He looked at Rachel for a long time, then took her hand. For the first time in many years, his voice trembled. "If you really do this, you must understand. It's not just justice that's been violated, but people willing to do anything to protect the lies. They don't just distort paperwork, they distort memories." Rachel looked at him. "I will say my mother's name, in front of him, in front of the press, in front of the cameras. And if anyone asks why I'm doing this, I will say, because a child can't stay silent forever." That evening, the groundbreaking ceremony for the Aurora Rising complex was held with grandiosity at the very place that had once been Monroe land. The area had been flattened, paved with concrete, and a massive stage was erected with dozens of spotlights. The podium placed in front of Whitaker Global's new logo, carved in high relief on a LED wall backdrop. The guests were high society, politicians, and major media outlets from Houston, Dallas, even Forbes and the New York Times. Elise Harrington arrived with a large entourage of bodyguards and PR staff, her platinum hair styled up, wearing a designer dress and a diamond ring as large as a grape, ready for Brandon to publicly announce their engagement as planned. But Brandon was not there. Not yet. At the back of the stage, Rachel Monroe and Luther entered through the workers' entrance. Brandon had used internal access to create fake IDs for both of them, allowing them into the backstage area unnoticed. They wore baseball caps, reflective vests, looking like lighting engineers or electrical system technicians. Rachel hid the original files in a cloth bag tucked under her jacket. The originals, with signatures, with red stamps, with Carter's handwritten notes. Brandon had helped her make copies of everything, but she wanted to bring the real documents to light. The countdown to 0 hour was approaching. On stage, the MC began the event, praising Carter Whitaker's strategic vision and the Whitaker family's community spirit over 3 generations. The audience clapped, and the LED screen displayed images of the project: skyscrapers, resorts, a daycare center, and a bold line of text appeared like a challenge. A new beginning for Aurora, where history is rewritten from vision. Rewritten? Rachel clenched her fists. They weren't rewriting, they were erasing. Behind the scenes, Brandon appeared. No suit, no tie, just a light gray shirt with slight wrinkles, dark pants. He walked straight into the backstage area, his eyes finding Rachel. "Ready?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. Rachel nodded. "Today, no one will be forced to disappear anymore." Brandon nodded back. His eyes were different now. No more hesitation, no more conflict. But the look in his eyes was that of a man who knew he would sever the ties of blood that bound him to the lies. The flashes of cameras kept flashing relentlessly like artificial lightning on the red carpet that stretched from the parking area to the main entrance of the Whitaker Future Complex inauguration stage. Reporters pushed and shoved, raising their cameras, their mouths filled with polished words, the young CEO full of promise. Component placement: Brandon, Elise, the new power couple; Zrania, a new legacy for America. But the moment Brandon Whitaker appeared, without Elise by his side, but with a black woman in a dusty gray coat, wearing old boots and eyes that didn't belong to the spotlight, the space seemed to freeze. The cameras paused for half a second. Some recognized her, Rachel Monroe, the owner of a small garage who had appeared on local television for her vocational training campaign for poor youth. But in this moment, she wasn't there to teach skills. She was there to deliver a death sentence for an empire. From the top of the stage steps, Carter Whitaker appeared. In a perfectly tailored dark blue suit, a dark purple tie, a white flower pinned, he stepped out like a king without a crown, with a practiced smile and a hand raised as if bestowing life upon the land. He spotted Brandon and froze. His sharp gaze turned to suspicion, then to anger. "Who did you bring here?" The question wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a punch thrown squarely at the heart of the event. Brandon stood firm. "The one who knows the land you stole the most." A silence echoed beneath the music of the opening ceremony. A few reporters looked up, their eyes, once only searching for fashion scandals, now sniffing a political explosion, and possibly a criminal one. Carter clenched his jaw, smiling thinly. "Go into the office. Now." The makeshift office behind the stage was adorned with luxurious wood paneling, soundproof reflective glass, air conditioning, and imported leather chairs. But when the door closed behind Rachel, the chill in the room came from Carter's gaze, not the air conditioner. He stood close to the desk, both hands pressing down on the wooden edge as though waiting for a judgment. "What do you want?" he asked. No small talk. Rachel looked straight into his eyes. "I want my mother." "She's dead," Carter replied quickly, his voice flat, like someone who had repeated this line 100 times. Accident. 15 years ago. There's a death certificate. I have a handwritten letter from her, Rachel said, pulling out an old letter from her jacket, sealed in plastic. The handwriting matches the records from the Aurora Hospital in 2005. She didn't die. She was forced to disappear. Carter didn't blink. He looked at the letter as though it was a stain on his own clothes. "You don't understand this game, Miss Monroe," he said coldly. "Do you think emotions will win against a corporation?" "I don't need emotions. I have evidence," Rachel replied, placing a USB drive on the desk. "How much?" Carter hissed through his teeth. "How much for you to disappear?" Rachel didn't budge an inch. "I don't need money. I need my mother." Carter laughed. A deep, cold laugh with no humor, like he had heard this line from an amateur actor in a student tragedy. "Do you think your mother's still alive? After all these years? You think I kept her locked up in my wine cellar?" "No," Rachel replied coldly. "I know she's being kept in one of the medical centers managed by the Whitaker Foundation, listed as psychiatric care. But in reality, it's a place to lock people away, not suitable for the future of the company." Carter blinked. For the first time. Rachel saw it, and she knew she had struck the blind spot. "All right." Carter sat down, pulled a check from the drawer, and took out a pen. $10 million. Sign the non-disclosure agreement. I'll let you and your daughter live in peace. Get out of Aurora. No one will touch you again. "I don't need peace," Rachel said. "I need justice to live in peace." She stood up. "This conversation has gone on long enough." Rachel turned to leave, but before stepping out the door, she pulled her phone from her jacket pocket and raised it to show the screen. "Recording in progress." Carter jumped up, his face turning pale. "You—" "Everything you just said," Rachel said slowly, "has been recorded, and it will be released at the right moment. My son would never allow—" "Brandon is no longer the good son," Rachel interrupted. "He has chosen his side, you will know, in a few minutes." As Rachel walked out of the office, Brandon was waiting for her in the hallway. Their eyes met, no words needed. Rachel handed him the USB drive. Brandon nodded. Everything was in place. Outside, the MC was introducing Carter as he stepped onto the stage to cut the ribbon for the grand opening. Spotlights focused on the main stage. Elise was smiling awkwardly. The reporters were ready. Brandon looked at Rachel, quietly asking, "Are you ready?" Rachel looked up at the stage, where he would have to hear his own voice, echoing before hundreds of cameras. She nodded. Now he will know. He can't silence a woman with a piece of paper and a threat. At the main stage of the Whitaker Future Complex project launch, the spotlight shone down on Carter Whitaker as he stepped up to the podium, his face tense but still maintaining a semblance of calm. Below, the media raised cameras and lenses, focused on the founder of the financial empire about to expand into Southeast Asia. One hand rested on the microphone while the other adjusted the button on his vest, a familiar gesture he often made whenever he needed to conceal something. But today, that veil of composure wouldn't be enough to hide what was waiting for him backstage. Just as he was about to speak, the sound from the main speaker suddenly shifted in tone. His voice echoed, but it wasn't coming from his mouth. "Did you really think emotion would win over a corporation? How much would it take for you to disappear? I decide who gets locked away." The voice of Carter Whitaker rang out loud and clear, coldly, and it was a recording from just 15 minutes earlier. The entire auditorium fell silent. Not a single camera flashed. No journalist dared blink. The MC stood frozen. Elise, standing in the VIP section, slowly raised her phone, activating the live stream. Rachel and Brandon ascended the stage steps. No one stopped them, no one dared intervene. Carter turned around, his face drained of color as if jolted awake from a power-driven dream. He roared at his son, but Brandon only looked him in the eye, this time no longer addressing him as Dad. "I can't hide this anymore," Brandon said, his voice deep but carrying. Not just because her mother was wrongfully imprisoned for 20 years, but because of all the others who've been buried under the name of development by you. Carter took a step forward, his hand raised to turn off the microphone. But Rachel stopped him. She stood at the edge of the stage, her hand gripping the shimmering silver ring in the spotlight. "Today, I'm not speaking for myself," she said, her voice steady. "I speak for a woman they declared dead." Then she turned her head, looking toward the back of the hall, where a figure was entering. Amelia Monroe. Her hair streaked with gray, her frame thinner, her steps slow and slightly limping, but her gaze unchanged. The gaze of a mother who had never forgotten the daughter she had been forced to leave behind. The auditorium was stunned into silence. Rachel gasped softly, "Mom." Amelia nodded, tears welling up but never falling. "My daughter." The entire hall rose to their feet, some out of instinct, others because they couldn't believe what was happening. Cameras were flashing furiously. One reporter shouted, "It's her! The name on the death certificate, Amelia Monroe." Luther followed behind Amelia, his face taut with tension. He helped her up the stage steps and then stepped back as she stood beside Rachel, her weathered hand gently touching her daughter's cheek, as if to assure herself this wasn't just a dream. Amelia turned toward the crowd, her voice hoarse but clear. "I'm not dead. I was placed in a hidden medical facility under the legal authority of Carter Whitaker, who claimed I was senile after the fake death of my husband and the land loss. They kept me there for 20 years and prevented me from finding my daughter." No one laughed, no one coughed, only silence, an eerie silence that could only exist between two seismic shifts. Brandon stepped forward, holding out the original file, along with a copy of the fraudulent land transfer contract, Amelia's letters, and the medical certificate from the detention center, confirming there was no medical record justifying the prolonged confinement. He spoke. "Everything is here, and I, Brandon Whitaker, confirm that my father committed illegal human rights and ethical violations. From today, I officially withdraw from all representation of Whitaker Global." Carter stormed toward his son, his voice trembling with fury. "You dare!" Brandon looked at him. "I'm no longer the obedient heir," he said. "I'm the one who wants to end this dynasty built on the blood of others." Elise, still standing at the edge of the stage, watched it all through her phone's lens. Her live stream was reaching over 300,000 viewers, and the number was skyrocketing by the second. She whispered, "Congratulations, Carter, the show's over." Rachel stepped forward, her voice calm and resolute. "My mother once said, there are lies so big that people are willing to kill to keep them secret. But one day, those lies will crack under the weight of the truth. Today is that day." She looked at Carter, now as pale as a lifeless shell. "You thought you could erase a name, but you forgot that people like me don't disappear. We just wait for the right moment to come back and reclaim every inch of land, every memory, every person you buried alive with your laws." The shockwave hadn't stopped. On the main stage of the Whitaker Future Complex inauguration, amid the flashing lights and the microphones trembling in the hands of the reporters, An empire crumbled right before the eyes of the public. But what had just happened was only the first layer of a bottomless abyss. Brandon Whitaker stood motionless. His body felt frozen before the presence of Amelia Monroe, the woman who had just come back from the dead, and the mother of Rachel, and by all logic, could not be unrelated to him. Carter, standing not far from him, had a pale face, but his eyes darkened like a cornered beast. He knew the moment of silence was over. Before hundreds of lenses, dozens of witnesses, and an internet exploding outside, the truth could not be swallowed back. Brandon turned to face his father, his voice choked like the first breeze of fall sneaking through an empty house. Why? A simple question. But within it lay the entire fracture of trust, of family, of the name he had carried his entire life. Carter took a deep breath. Then he released his grip from the podium and stood up straight, like he was returning to an old role, the puppet master controlling everything from the shadows. Because it's the largest underground water source in the state, he said, his voice calm as though giving a financial report. It lies beneath the Monroe family land, the only region not exploited, not invaded by private groundwater extraction companies. He glanced at Rachel, then at Amelia, trembling by her daughter's side. It's worth billions. For some, it's just a water stream. For me, it's the future, the power that no one dares to touch. Brandon stepped back half a pace, as though a stone had just fallen onto his chest, but Carter didn't stop. He turned to Brandon, his lips curling into a cruel smile. And you, Brandon, you are not my son. The entire hall seemed to stop breathing. Whispers, cameras, flashes, all choked in a vacuum of shock. Rachel stumbled. Amelia clutched her chest. Brandon seemed to be falling freely, no parachute, no anchor. What? He repeated softly, unable to believe his own ears. And then Elise Harrington stepped forward. No more evening gown, no more the picture of a high society debutante. In her hands was an old brown file, its edges worn, with faded text on the cover. Whitaker Foundation, Orphan Integration Program. She stepped straight to the center of the stage, her voice clear. I thought I was about to marry a perfect heir, but the truth is different. She raised the file. Brandon Whitaker is one of 5 orphaned children personally adopted by the Carter family from various orphanages over the past 20 years under their charity fronts. All identities were cleaned up using power, money, and the family's personal lawyers. Elise flipped to the first page. A small, blurry photo was attached next to the file of Brandon M., Open Heart Orphanage, Houston, 2003. Brandon clenched his fists, his eyes wide. I really am. Rachel, still standing motionless, seemed to suddenly realize something. She stepped closer to Amelia, her voice trembling as she asked, Mom, when I was at Open Heart, you once said, there was a blonde-haired boy there, often bullied. You said, at the time, you asked Luther to send him a wooden pin, right? Amelia turned to Rachel, tears flooding down her face but not falling. Yes, that was your brother. Elise nodded slightly, delivering the final blow. He and Rachel are siblings, same mother. No one moved. Even Carter Whitaker, the man who always knew how to control the situation, stood stiff as stone. In a raw moment, the empire he had built with papers, property, and lies came to the point of no return. Bloodlines. Brandon, his face pale, took 2 steps back as if the entire stage was collapsing. I've lived my whole life trying to become the person you wanted, but it turns out I was never chosen for who I am. I was just a replacement for the son you lost." Carter didn't reply. His lips were tightly pressed, like a condemned man standing before the final verdict. Brandon forced a smile, a laugh choked with blood. "Do you know what the greatest pain is, Carter? It's not being betrayed. It's realizing you've never belonged anywhere." He turned to Rachel, his eyes no longer trembling. "But now I know I still have a place to belong." Rachel nodded. And in that moment, the two people who had seemed to be thrown to opposite sides by life finally connected through truth, through blood. No need for a will, no need for testimony. In the moment when no one could find the words, the blaring siren of police cars cut through the air like a sharp, cold knife. From two directions of the inauguration area, SUVs bearing the symbols of the FBI and the Houston Police Department entered, their flashing lights illuminating the entire area. A SWAT team quickly surrounded the stage. Carter Whitaker spun around. His face turned pale, his eyes darting back and forth in search of an escape, but the Aurora field now had no way out for him. A middle-aged senior officer stepped onto the stage. He pulled a warrant from his jacket pocket and spoke clearly into the microphone. "Carter James Whitaker, you are under arrest for the following charges: forgery of legal documents, extortion, illegal detention, federal money laundering, and concealing identities and adoption records. You have the right to remain silent." Brandon, Rachel, Amelia, and Elise stood silently behind, witnessing a scene they would likely never forget. The man who once held power over the law, the media, and the fate of thousands, now handcuffed under the gaze of public opinion. Carter still hadn't spoken, but his eyes, now, no longer held authority, but were hollow, like a ghost that had lost its name. The press immediately swarmed. Television cameras captured the full scene. Elise's live stream surpassed 3.2 million views, trending nationwide within the hour. 48 hours later, America was in an uproar. The front pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and even local papers screamed with headlines: "Whitaker Empire Exposed, Illegal Detention and Land-Grabbing Scandal." The rise of the Monroe family. Victim becomes the witness bringing justice to light. Brandon Monroe, the heir without the bloodline of Whitaker, speaks out: "I no longer bear the name of a fraud." In a press conference held 3 days later, Brandon announced he was renouncing the Whitaker name and officially reclaiming his birth name, Brandon Monroe. He confirmed with notarized documents and the original records from the Open Heart Orphanage. His identity, once erased, was now fully restored. He stood beside Rachel and Amelia, speaking to hundreds of journalists. "My father was not Carter Whitaker. My family was not built on power but on loss, pain, and truth. From today, I am Brandon Monroe, and I stand here to say that the truth always finds its way back." The Aurora Rising project was permanently halted. All investment contracts were withdrawn within 72 hours of the incident. The National Investment Oversight Committee launched a federal investigation into Whitaker Global's satellite companies. An emergency law was passed by the state of Texas, requiring a review of all forced land deals over the past 20 years, especially those with signatures or traces of Carter Whitaker. What about the Monroe family's land? 6 weeks later, Brandon and Rachel co-signed a transfer of the Aurora land to create a community preservation area called Amelia's Haven, a space preserving the precious underground water sources and designed as an ecological park, keeping the history of a forgotten community intact. On the old grounds of the inauguration, a free vocational school was set up, the Monroe Institute for Youth Futures, serving people of color, immigrants, and orphans once neglected by the system. Luther Monroe, though elderly, was invited to serve as the honorary principal, overseeing vocational training in machinery, mechanics, and engineering for the new generation. Amelia Monroe, after 20 years buried alive by the system, had her legal status fully restored. A federal court ruling confirmed the death certificate signed by Carter was fraudulent, and her confinement in a medical facility for 2 decades was deemed a severe violation of human rights. At the memorial for the land return, she gave a brief, emotional speech. "They may have faked my death, but they could not kill my memory. They could not bury a mother who wanted to find her child." The entire preservation area fell silent, then erupted into applause as loud as thunder. Carter Whitaker, after the initial hearing, was detained without bail. The FBI continued to expand their investigation into transactions in New York, Chicago, and Miami, where he had once manipulated multiple urban planning projects. His underground financial network, illegal adoption records, and custodial medical centers disguised as charitable institutions were all brought to light. He faced more than 23 federal charges and could be sentenced to life in prison without parole. Rachel Monroe, from a quiet single mother, became the new symbol of civil justice. Time magazine featured her on the cover of their year-end issue with the headline, "The Woman Who Made an Empire Fall." When asked in an interview, she simply replied, "I don't need to be famous. I just need my daughter to grow up in a world where no one can be erased with a stamp." 6 months had passed since the night when the light of justice illuminated the stage of an inauguration, once the place where an empire of power had fallen. Now, at Monroe Auto Works, there were no longer walls peeling with paint, no longer the sounds of old machinery groaning or the greasy oil smell that clung to the passage of time. The small mechanic shop, once forgotten on the outskirts of Aurora, had been transformed into a community technical training center, with new machinery, a dedicated apprenticeship area, a community room, and a large sign hanging in the center. "Monroe Auto Works. We fix cars, and we mend lives." Rachel Monroe stood in the midst of it all, her curly hair neatly tied up, wearing a technical jacket with the Monroe Foundation logo on her left chest. On the table, a toolbox lay, next to a group of women, single mothers, learning how to dismantle a carburetor from an old Honda. She taught clearly, practically without any embellishments but with powerful energy. Being a mechanic doesn't require muscles, just a mind and hands that know how to be patient, just like being a mother. A few women smiled. A young girl who was pregnant softly said, "Miss Rachel, no one has ever taught me anything kind until today." Rachel bent down, adjusted the gloves on the girl's hands, and gently said, "I was once like you, but someone gave me a second chance. Now it's your turn." In the back of the workshop, where there used to be an old warehouse, now converted into the headquarters of the Monroe Foundation, a non-profit organization founded by Brandon Monroe. He walked in, holding project files about a new children's shelter soon to be launched on the outskirts of Houston. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, collar unbuttoned, hair a little messy. Brandon was no longer Brandon Whitaker, global CEO, but a man who had rejected the fame built on falsehoods and chosen to rebuild from the roots, with his real name and the truth. An employee walked up. "Brandon, Open Heart Organization just sent over a list of 12 orphans wanting to register for vocational training starting next month." He nodded. "Great, make sure the kids get free transportation." He turned to look out the window, where a little girl with curly hair was busy drawing a picture on the concrete with chalk. Naomi, Rachel's daughter, and now his niece. And in the midst of all this, connecting everything, was Amelia Monroe. Her hair had mostly turned gray, but her eyes were brighter than ever. She brought a tray of lemonade outside, placed it on the wooden table on the porch, and then sat down in the familiar wicker chair that Luther had made by hand. The marks of time on her face were no longer sorrow, but the stitching of surviving memories. Rachel stepped out behind, wiping her hands while smiling. "Mom, you should rest. Let me take care of it." Amelia just smiled, handed Rachel a glass of water, then handed another to Brandon as he stepped out. The three of them sat together, watching the bustling workshop, the children playing under the porch, and the plants that were growing from the land once trampled by construction vehicles. Amelia looked at the sapphire ring on Rachel's hand, the only thing that had remained unbroken after 2 decades of being bent by power, and said, "That ring, it has always kept us connected, even though no one knew." Rachel gently touched the sparkling stone, her eyes brimming. Brandon placed his hand on the table, smiling faintly. "I used to think I didn't belong anywhere, but actually what binds us together isn't the family name, the legacy, or the fame. It's a memory that cannot be erased. It's promises no one kept, but no one ever forgot." Amelia nodded, her voice choked with emotion. "And sometimes the truth doesn't just free us, it resurrects. It resurrects a family, it shatters an empire, to rebuild something truly worth it." They were silent for a moment, letting the sounds of children playing and the hum of machinery blend like a symphony of reconstruction. There was nothing more to say. Everything was already clear. That afternoon, as the sun began to cast a golden glow on the freshly painted walls of the workshop, Naomi ran up to hug Brandon. "Uncle Brandon, tell me more about the wood carver story." He bent down, hugging her. "Next time. I still have to write one more letter." "A letter to who?" Brandon looked out the window, where black and white photos were pasted on the office wall. Images of children who had been illegally adopted, lost their records, erased from the system. He answered softly, "To a child who has no one to stand for them, so that when they grow up they'll know there are still people who don't forget." That day, the sky over Aurora felt as though it had been washed clean after a great storm. The sunlight shone through the lemonade glass on the table, making the sapphire ring on Rachel's hand glow with a soft light. In the genuine laughter of the three people, the mother who had been erased, the daughter who had been abandoned, and the son who once seemed to have no roots, a family was reborn from the ashes. And the ring was still there, shining like a curse that had become a promise, an unbroken circle, a proof that the truth, though delayed, always finds its way back. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, to spread the message of justice, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next touching stories. Because sometimes just one ring, or one memory, is enough to awaken an entire generation that had been forced to stay silent.